When the trailer for Cyberpunk Edgerunners came out, I was a bit late to seeing it, but to say that I was excited is a massive understatement. I was one of the many people who was unfortunate enough to play Cyberpunk on its release. I luckily didn't have as many complications as it seemed everyone else had, but it was still a pretty bug-riddled mess of a launch. But I thoroughly enjoyed just about every moment of the actual gameplay, and getting into the storylines and all the lore that was presented in the game format. So when I saw there was going to be an anime made using that world, I was extremely skeptical at first, but also extremely hopeful. And the trailer actually looked really good, and now that it's here, it's probably one of the best shows I've seen in quite a while. I'm actually a massive fan of the cyberpunk aesthetic in general, and I've actually been somewhat working on a story of my own, but I don't currently have the ability to make it. But overall, just the dark and gritty nature of most of the cyberpunk stories just hooks me. I love the idea of the cybernetics and the crazy monopolized corporations that run the entire world with neon signs and unsanitized technology, criminal activities running rampant throughout crazy concrete jungles, virtual reality mixing with real life in a near perfect synchronization. All of this with the elegant beauty of the more fortunate that perfectly contradicts the entirety of it all. It's everything I want and makes for one of the most amazing worlds that anyone could ever write about, in my opinion. I don't think you actually need to play the game to understand and enjoy the show, but going into it with the knowledge I had from playing the game, it definitely enhanced my viewing experience, and I didn't really have to figure things out as the show went on because I already knew most of what they were talking about. And it's also just really cool to be able to go in the game and see the world from a different perspective, which is normally just a thing we can't do with most shows, for obvious reasons. And I think that's a really cool aspect that most people don't really think about when there's a video game and an anime or TV show crossover, but you can actually experience the world for yourself, and that's really cool. And before I get too far into it, here's a minor spoiler warning. Nothing major will be spoiled right now, but later on there will be. I'll put another spoiler warning at that section, but for now, just here's a quick minor spoiler warning. So to just quickly explain the story, the main character David goes to an Arasaka Academy school, whatever, which is far outside of him and his mother's price range, but she wanted to give him the best education possible to give him a real chance at becoming a corporate man and working up as high as he can at the Arasaka company, which is one of the main powers that actually runs the world. Unfortunately, things don't really go to plan, and David ends up being expelled and has a fair amount of debt that he has to deal with, so of course he follows down the only natural path, which is that of a cyberpunk.
あんたたちサイバーパンクか。だったらどうした？
And the show's basically that, and the addition of his life as a cyberpunk, which is the primary focus of the show. There's a decent amount of nudity and violence in this. I think within the first 5 minutes maybe of the first episode, you're probably going to be able to tell if you enjoy the show or not. There's a lot of really crazy fights with it being set in the cyberpunk world. There's also a lot of crazy cybernetics that are used, but for the most part, it's just gun violence, hacking, and David zooming around with his cybernetic. Each fight has a load of gory moments, usually revolving around exploding heads and flying limbs, and bright red blood covering anything and everything. It's pretty easy to overdo it with the amount of gore and stuff usually, but in this world it fits pretty well having this amount of gore for the most part, just due to the darker nature of cyberpunk stuff in general. And with it being the more futuristic cyberpunky world, a lot of the character designs are all extremely unique and stand out a lot more than in other shows. Any of the actual characters are quite flashy and eccentric and leave a memorable impression, with a majority of them having body augmentations and stuff like that. But despite that, David and Lucy make me think of Gallo and Leo from Promare a lot. You know, the entire show actually gives off massive Promare vibes, being it's from the same studio, it's got a more futuristic setting, and just the color usage in general makes me think of Promare quite a bit while watching it, which isn't really a bad thing, but the comparison's there. And I just felt like bringing it up. But the show primarily circles around a main crew consisting of the main character David, the leader of the group Maine, I assume his second in command Dorio, I'm not entirely sure, A guy who doesn't get enough screen time for as crazy as he is, Pillar. His sister Rebecca. There's two netrunners, Kiwi and Lucy. And finally Falco, who I think is a driver, but I'm not entirely sure how much she's actually involved in the gang other than that. But I think that Lucy and Rebecca are more or less tied for my favorite character, and I'm leaning towards Rebecca because she's like this little gun-loving monster who ends up being a lot less stupid in the second half of the show, and I think her ending specifically is a lot more impactful than any of the other characters. But she's just this absolutely chaotic, trigger-happy person, and I don't understand how she wouldn't be most people's favorite character. Literally every scene she's in is just amazing. She is hands down the best character in the main group, and nobody will ever change my mind. Where I think that Lucy is meant to be more of the waifu character of the show, with most people probably gravitating towards enjoying her and David's relationship throughout the entirety of it. Which she's definitely a great character, but the more I think about it, the more I'm behind Rebecca as being the best. But with Lucy being more of a primary focused character, she gets a lot more screen time and you get to know her a bit more, with the dynamic between her and David being, I would say, a bit too predictable, but it's kind of cute and I really enjoyed it. And it's not a super crazy spoiler, but they do end up getting together, and it breaks one of my most hated things in anime with romance in general, and it's not just building up to a handhold at the end or a light kiss as the final credits roll, but it's like an actual relationship that, granted, it's a bit fast, but you actually get to see it develop and flourish into something else. I just want to see more relationships that actually happen early on in shows, with a lot more relationship aspects rather than just the will they won't they bullshit that's rampant throughout all of anime. Which, I mean, isn't always bad, but I just want more variation with the whole relationship dynamics. I don't think that's too much to ask for, and this show actually delivers on that. But even with the relationship being there, the character motivations between the two of them is one of the lower points of the show for me, personally. I think that David's actions make a lot more sense because he's been built up to basically live up to everyone else's expectation throughout the show, with everyone having like their own paths laid out for him specifically. But when it comes to Lucy, I really don't understand why she's keeping everything from David when it also heavily involves him. Unless she's trying to keep it from him feeling entirely guilty about it, but she seems to have some pretty severe trust issues either way, for valid reasons, I suppose, with multiple characters making it a very prominent point throughout the show to not trust other people in Night City. But I feel like she could have at least given him something, rather than, oh, I can't tell you, and hiding as much as she can from him. It just ends with both of them being basically blindsided by not properly communicating with each other. Had they actually discussed things, David would have realized that maybe the cyber skeleton wasn't the best idea, and that Rebecca was probably right. And everyone else would have realized that David was just spiraling downhill a lot quicker than anyone actually realized. But an idiot main character with a closed-off love interest just makes for a fun climax, doesn't it? I also just want to mention how amazing I think David looks in the cyber skeleton. It's super cool. I do an awful Frankie, I'm so sorry. I don't really have a good place to slot this in, but I just wanted to quickly mention the soundtrack. I'm not very musically adept, but I thought the music was fantastic and matched perfectly in every situation and really blended well into every scene. The opening was great, the outro was great, everything between was just as good, and I feel like it's really hard to miss when it comes to a majority of music in shows, but for this specifically, it sticks out a lot more with just how nicely it adds to everything and just how different it is in comparison to most generic anime OSTs, and really just enhances the show overall. But for the most part, I think this show does just about everything as near perfect as it could, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I didn't have some issues with it. The first thing I'm gonna nitpick is the colors. When you think of Cyberpunk, obviously the bright neon colors come immediately to mind. The intense lights of bright blues and pinks and reds and greens, but that's not really all I think of. I think more of like a dark and dirty world that's a lot more moody and less colorful, I guess. It's obviously just a really small thing, but I would have liked to see that portrayed more instead of the brightly colored atmosphere that's throughout the entire show. Everything for the most part is just way too clean looking for me personally. There's a lot of scenes that do show the darker side of the city, but I don't think it's anywhere near enough, and literally every vehicle in the show looks like it just came out of the factory, with all of them being entirely pristine, and none of them really showing any like grime except for his mother's car in the first episode had some, I think, on the interior. Again, very small nitpick, and it doesn't really take away from the show at all, but it's just not what I expect when thinking of cyberpunk worlds. Another thing is the show itself is just rather fast-paced, but it's not in a bad way, if that makes sense. But it's almost like they tried their hardest to include as many really interesting plot points as possible that they could into a single season. I guess it's more like I wish they would have spent a little more time on each thing and expanded it a lot more instead of moving through it all rather quickly. Like with episode 5 and the BD guy, the entire conflict lasted like an episode, and it could have been so much longer with cat and mouse type antics and them actually tracking him down each time, but it was just in and out really quickly, and I felt like he was a really interesting character that they could have expanded on infinitely. I really wanted to see more of him and his work, and I thought they could have utilized him more than just being a lure for somebody else. But immediately after that, in episode 6, it feels like an entire finale, and then episode 7, it just skips ahead to like a completely different arc. It feels like there should have been a break in between, and it should have been separated into 2 seasons entirely for the amount of stuff that they tried shoving into it. You get to see it all play out, and it fits rather well, but overall, it's just really fast and doesn't really slow down enough to let you sit and linger on things and let it build up in anticipation when it's all just constant action all the time. But I mean, obviously a show with constant action is great. But I think in contrast with a lot more character moments and actually building up the cast and just expanding on these moments that already existed would have been so much better. And just to quickly touch upon the animation, I think the animation's really good, but at times there's a few scenes that just linger on still frames a little bit too long. It's not all that common, but I think it's worth pointing out. There was actually a few times while watching where I had to stop and check to see if the video player was actually working or if it was broken, because it was just a still frame for that long. Unless that's just an error in the video player, and that makes this entire point redundant. But other than that, the animation's actually extremely nice all around, and I especially like the cyber psychosis stuff, and when David uses his cybernetics and goes into the slow motion bit. I thought those were pretty damn nice. But moving on to a more major spoiler for the first episode, but a minor spoiler overall. The anime trope that protagonists' parents are just always non-existent or dead stays true in this, but when his mom ends up dying, she's laying in the road. We got a bit of a normal reaction from David at that moment, but it was a bit too watered down in my opinion. And then when she actually dies later on, it's like he didn't even really give a shit and was just more worried about the money and what he was going to do and whatnot. Which, I mean, it's always an issue, but like his mother just died after engaging in an, albeit a rather lackluster verbal fight with him, but you'd think he'd be a bit more emotionally broken at that point and have a lot more of a meltdown, but I suppose in a way he ended up taking out most of his frustrations by punching the shitty bully character at school. But the entire first episode is basically a pointless moment of his mother dying because there's not really any emotional attachment between us and her as a character, and we don't get an actual scene of everything hitting David and the world crashing around him as everything he knows is just completely changed. But you don't really get to feel his emotion in that moment. Apart from that one scene of him trying to fight the bully character for implying his mother did some not so PG things for the money. But that's long before her death. Not really long. That's right before her death. But I don't know. The entire episode just kind of rubbed me the wrong way with his reaction to his mother's literal death. So it feels like the only reason his mother even existed in the first place was to give us the idea that she was pushing for his future, which is kind of redundant in the grand scheme of the show, but I suppose adds to his character motivation. But now I'm going to go into some major spoilers for the ending and just throughout the show in general that I want to talk about. So if you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend either skipping to the time on the screen right now until you watch it, or I don't know, just pause here and go watch it, I guess. So Kiwi betraying them didn't really make sense to me at all. Obviously, I get that she's very untrusting and taught Lucy this lesson, but at the same time, it seems really stupid to me. Like, surely she'd be in a much more comfortable position working with everybody else and constantly gaining money instead of selling out her friends and colleagues and sending them basically to their deaths for a quick payday. Faraday was getting paid, I think, 1 million eddies, so he's probably keeping a vast majority of it. So she's essentially selling out her entire crew for, at absolute most, 500k for a 50-50. More than likely, it's a lot less with a massive risk. And I'm assuming, considering the apartment and all of David's upgrades in the second half of the show, the crew must have been doing at least fairly well if he splits it all evenly. So I just don't see the logic in it, and it was presented as more of a job offer to her that she agreed with, and even after realizing who the target was, she still went through with it for the money. But, like, don't get me wrong, the money she was probably getting paid wasn't awful, but more than likely, it wasn't kill your friends and completely relocate your entire life type of money. Even the one-way trip to the moon was like 250k, which is probably a more regular occurrence rather than, like, some extravagant luxury that only the top of the top rich can afford. It's probably not like a super regular thing, but I would imagine that it's more like a nice vacation every few years maybe type money. So like there probably wasn't enough money to betray everyone, in my opinion. But I guess that's just the world they live in. A lot of the character decisions in general were just strange to me, but it makes sense if I'm looking at it from a different perspective with a lot more context than they had in that moment. But I feel like a vast majority of the main character deaths could have easily been avoided had they just like actually sat down and talked to each other and listened. Unfortunately, that probably doesn't make for a good show, so why not kill everyone? But like, Pillar was just stupid. Dorio and Maine was literally because Maine refused to downgrade at all, even after showing severe cyberpsychosis, and they literally tried helping him. Kiwi betrayed her friends only to then be betrayed herself, which, haha, karma. Rebecca didn't deserve that at all, and I'm still upset they took her out like that, but goddamn was that an awesome scene. And David was going down the exact same path that Maine took, but he chose to end it on his own terms to save Lucy, and I respect it. But it feels like they didn't even need to be put in that spot in the first place. Like, a lot of the deaths seems like it was just stupidity that killed all of them. And also having the series end with a fight with Atom Smasher, like the video game, was great, in my opinion. They mentioned him in the show, and at first I was like, there's no way he's actually going to be in the show, only to then have him be essentially a boss fight in the show. I was wondering how they were going to deal with it all canonically if he died in both the series and the game, but I was expecting a happy ending at that point, and it makes a lot more sense now for canon looking back at it. Also, I can't believe they did my man Delamain like that. Cyberpunk Edgerunners is definitely in the running for one of my favorite shows of recent times, and probably one of the best game-to-show adaptations ever, but I think they definitely get away with it a lot easier because of how amazing the world that CD Projekt Red built, that you can just throw a story into it and get something incredible. It's not without its flaws, but perfection doesn't really exist, except for Delamain. I swear to God, if anyone disrespects that beautiful sentient AI again, But this was a fantastic show, and it makes me crave more cyberpunk content in general, whether that be the game or more shows with similar settings or whatever else they decide to bring out with the IP. I adore the cyberpunk aesthetic in just about every medium, and it's just been reinforced yet again. Whether you liked the game or hated it, the anime completely outshines it, and I highly recommend taking a look at it, especially if you like nudity and violence. Thanks for watching.
What happened?
Look around and connect the dots.